Okay, so we are dedicating this class to Amanya's cousin's husband, who unfortunately is very sick in Moscow, Ilya Eppelbaum. And it should be refuah shlema, a healing to her cousin's husband and to all Jewish people that need a healing. Also, I have the positive news that my son Mendy and his wife Sarah had a baby girl last night. So, so we could also dedicate the class to the baby, Mushka, the daughter of Sarah Rachel, and Sarah, healthy baby, healthy mommy, Sarah Rachel, the daughter of Hannah.
Wow, Mazel Tov.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I guess it's the girl season in the Turin family.
Yes. It's a new tide in the Turin family.
Yeah. See, God gave me boys because they're easier. He's giving me my granddaughters, so it all works out.
Exactly, to enjoy.
Exactly. No, I am. I hope, God willing. Wait, this is a little quiet. Let me see if I can get a little louder here. Okay, great. Now we're loud enough. All right, so let's get started. So hopefully the class, I'm sorry for all the snafus in the beginning. As I said, I was completely unaware. I'm not the only person that uses a Zoom account, and the password got changed, and I had no clue. I'm on. Nobody else is on, but I'm on. So thank God I looked at my phone. I'm like, let me check what's going on. It's too suspicious. Where is everyone? So and then thank you, Moshe, that we figured out that the password had gotten changed on us. So all is good. Now we can learn. And it's been a while, but we're going back to Jewish history. What we were doing until the holidays intervened. So we took a break from Jewish history to learn about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, and we had a beautiful party last week. Thank you for those that managed to come, and for those that didn't, you missed out. But I just said, you know, it's Sukkot, it's Sukkot, and I just felt we should be in a sukkah. So I was really glad that worked out, and God willing, we should be together soon. Not only virtually, I mean, virtually has advantages. It's easier. You don't have to get in a car. You don't have to deal with cold weather when it gets cold. You have to deal with parking. But there's something nice about seeing people. Okay, so this goes back a while ago because it's been a while since we discussed Jewish history. So I'm going to remind us a little bit of what we might have forgotten, and then we'll continue and move forward. I'm just going to close my door because it's really noisy. Sorry, it was just a little noisy there. So let's talk about the tragic fate of the Chashmonai. Not such a fun lesson today, unfortunately, but I'm sure, like a lot of these lessons, you know, we look at the history and we look at the past, sort of can understand for the future. So that's good. That, you know, we glean from what happened. But as I was preparing, I did feel a little, oh no, God, why are these people making all these tragic mistakes that are destroying the Jewish people one more time? Like, why is this happening? But it's part of the process for us to ultimately, of course, bring Mashiach, which, as we discussed previously, is very, very, very opportune this year. And we really, 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 really hope it's going to happen. This is the time. So we were discussing the era of the Chashmonaim, and we explained that after the final victory, or creeping towards the final victory, in the story of Hanukkah, we don't get into all the gory details, so it sounds a little faster and more glorious. The reality was slow and hard. But as we're coming towards the final victory with the final surviving son of the 5 sons of Matisyahu, we have Simon, who takes the throne. And we said, really, we could go back to his brother. We don't have to blame Shimon per se, because, of course, the famous warrior of the Chashmonaim was Yehuda the Maccabee. And we said that really the sages go back to him, that when he had this victory, again, if we're assuming that he was there when the temple was conquered, because if you remember, we explained there's really two conflicting dates of when the temple was finally freed. But at that moment, he could have turned to the sages and say, okay, we did our job. Now appoint the ruler, the king from the house of David. He didn't do it. And the Chashmonim retained their priest, warrior, ruler status for all the years of the fighting. And when the fighting was finally over, the last remaining Chashmonai, Shimon, Simon, he was continuing the same route. He was the ruler. He was the warrior, trying, of course, to create peace, but there was still a lot of wars going on. At the same time, he was the high priest. So there's a lot of problems here with the Chashmonai rule. The main central problem, of course, is the rules are only supposed to be from the house of David. Not only from the house of David. Even if you're a direct descendant of David, that's not good enough. You have to be a descendant of David through Solomon. That's the line of the house of David. That's the line of rulers. That's ultimately the line of the Mashiach. So we see, going back to the Chashmonim already, we could say sort of like a conflict. Raising up against ultimately the house of David, which ultimately is Mashiach, by retaining the power. And also, on a secondary note, not as severe, but also a big problem, they retained status as the high priest, but they were also the warriors. A priest is supposed to be a man of peace. He's supposed to be the spiritual energy. He's not supposed to be the physical fighter and defender of the land of Israel. So if they wanted to be priests and do that, okay, but to be the high priest, to be the embodiment of priesthood, you have to be a person of spirituality and peace, not a warrior. So there was a lot of conflicting issues going on here. But again, the central theme is the lack of following God's will, that only from the house of David are kings, which again resonates very strongly with our time because that's Mashiach, direct descendant of Solomon, the son of David. So we're dealing with this now, and this was the critical issue then. So as we said, Simon became the ruler. He did not take the title of king, because of course he understood that only from the house of David could there be kings. But he was de facto the king, and he suffered greatly. And we discussed his rule, and we said his end was very painful. His son-in-law rebelled against him, if you remember. Simon had 3 sons and a daughter, I guess. I don't know how many daughters. His son-in-law rebelled against him, murdered him, and murdered 2 of his brother-in-law, Simon's son. And 1 son escaped. And so this son-in-law told me, which means he was such a Hellenist that we don't even know him as by his Jewish name. We only know him by his Hellenist name, because Ptolemy sounds like the kings of Egypt. But this is a nice Jewish boy. So this nice Jewish boy was such a Hellenist that that's how we know him, by his Hellenist name. Murdered his father-in-law, murdered his brother-in-laws to try to gain the throne. Now, he didn't have the ability to do this himself, so he plotted this assassination with the Assyrian king. In other words, he thought he'd have the backing of the Assyrian king, so he would have the backbone of that army to be able to take over. This is another Antiochus, you know, much removed from the original Antiochus. He's already Antiochus the 7th. But he, with the Assyrian king's backing, thought, okay, I'm going to get the throne. But there was one son who survived. He meant to kill out all of the sons. He wasn't trying to save any. But there was one son who survived, Yochanan Horkonos. And Yochanan Horkonos fought against him. Now, if you learn the history very briefly, you would just say, okay, you know, failed attempt, and, you know, Simon's gone and Yochanan Horkonos has the throne. But it was really not at all as simple as that. It was actually pretty bad, because Antiochus, the 7th now, with his army, was quite powerful. So even though Yochanan Horkonos was fighting with the Jews, fighting for what his ancestors had fought for over 20 years. His ancestors, his father and his uncles, right? It wasn't so far back. Over 25 years, his father and his uncles, 4 out of his 5 uncles, lose their lives in battle to gain the independence from the Assyrian regime. And now his brother-in-law puts him right back in the Assyrians' hands. In the end, they were not able to win over Antiochus, but Yochanan Horkonos made a peace treaty with him. Now, in this peace treaty, Antiochus had a lot of gains. Almost going back to what it was like pre the victory of the Chashmonaim. He had a lot of strong gains. There were 3 things when they settled for peace. There were 3 things he wanted. One is that the Jews stop fighting him. 2 is that all of these new Jewish territories have to pay tribute to him, which means, in essence, he's ruling them. And 3, he wanted to put a garrison. He wanted to put the Assyrian troops in Jerusalem. So Yochanan Horkonos agreed to the first condition. We're going to stop fighting. I mean, he knew he was losing this fight. God wasn't helping. And again, God wasn't helping at this point. The Chashmonaim have veered away from what God wanted. Like a lot of times, I think this is a very incredibly strong, painful lesson. When we look back at history, it's to teach us about the present situation. His father and his uncles self-sacrificed. His grandfather self-sacrificed. And their self-sacrifice is real. Their self-sacrifice was for years, and they saved the Jewish people, but they still failed a very critical test. And because of that, all we're going to see now is a string of tragedies, this thing of horrific problems, defeat after defeat after defeat. And sometimes, I think this is the lesson I take from this, that a lot of times when we do it how God wants, we feel bad, oh, we'll work out better this way, but all right, we got to give in to God. This is what God wants. What a pain, how difficult, how stymieing my life, how limiting me. But when we do what God wants, it works. And when we don't do it how God wants, it doesn't work. There's Maimonides speaks about this at length, and he says in his code of law, he says, when is all this reward that we're supposed to get for serving God? In the afterlife, in the times of Mashiach. Not now, not in this world. So what's all these promises of reward in this world? What's it all about? It's not the real reward. The real reward, we don't even know what it looks like. It's going to be in the afterlife. It's going to be in Mashiach. So what's all the promises in this world? So he says, you know what all that is? If you want to serve God, God says, I'm committing to give you good and to take away bad. Why? Because you want to serve me. Well, if you're busy dealing with bad, if you're busy dealing with your problems all day long, even if you want to serve me, you're not going to have time to serve me. You're not going to have a headspace to serve me. You're not going to have the ability to pray and to study and to say psalms and to give charity because you're going to be so bogged down. So you really want to serve me? I'm going to give you lots of good. I'm going to take away all the bad. But that's not even your reward. That's just functionality. So you can serve me. And later in your afterlife and later Mashiach, then I'll give you the real reward. So that's what Maimonides writes in his book of law on the concept of reward. And we see this very clearly with the Chashmonaim, that even though it was such an incredibly difficult test, and I don't know if anyone might have been able to pass it. It was a very difficult test, but of course God only tests you with how you're able to pass. So that means they did have the ability to pass because they were very, very great people. But if you don't do it God's way, it doesn't work. And it didn't work. So here we see, of course, 4 of them died in battle, and Shimon, Simon, the one that survived, gets murdered by his son-in-law. And then his remaining son, Yochanan Horkonos, when he's making this peace treaty with Antiochus, he almost goes backwards 25 years. Antiochus gets so much. They're going to pay taxes. They're going to stop fighting. The only thing he managed to do was, he said, don't put the soldiers in Jerusalem. That we can't take. But instead, we're going to give you lots of hostages, including actually many soldiers. It was interesting because, and we're going to see this reflected later in the history as well, we now see Jewish soldiers joining the Assyrian army. So these Jewish soldiers that joined initially were hostages, so to speak, were people that Yochanan Horkonos was giving to Antiochus to maintain that the Assyrian soldiers wouldn't take over Jerusalem. But these soldiers actually were really good soldiers to such a degree that we see recorded historically that Antiochus so much benefited from them and needed them that he didn't fight on the Sabbath and he didn't fight on Shavuos because these Jewish soldiers wouldn't fight then. I mean, they weren't slaves, I guess. They had some degree of autonomy and they said, we can't fight, these are holy days. And Antiochus didn't feel he'd win without these Jewish soldiers fighting for him. But what we're going to see later, I mean, it's going to come up later in history soon, the role these Jewish soldiers played in Antiochus's army. But Yochanan Horkonos made this peace treaty, and this is how they retained their somewhat autonomy, though it was pretty shaky at the time. And he bided his time. Yochanan Horkonos, at this point, was quite righteous. He was very righteous until the final year of his life, when he blew it big time, as we discussed before Rosh Hashanah. He said, I'm biding my time. I understand that the same way there were these intrigues in the Chashmonai court, which led to his father's murder and his brother's murder, there's going to be bigger intrigues in the Assyrian court. And that's exactly what happened. And 2 years later, when Antiochus now has a whole revolution going on by him, and he's actually murdered, Yochanan took that opportunity to revolt because he knew the Assyrians would be too busy dealing with their own problems to worry about him. And that's exactly what happened. And at that point, he revolted 2 years into the peace, and he regained the autonomous nature that his father and uncles had given their lives for. So Yochanan was, as I said, very righteous for the majority of his life, from which we also learn this very critical lesson. And I know we did discuss this before, but I just felt since it's been so long, I wanted to go back and to keep moving so we understand the flow of the Chashmonai Dynasty. He was so righteous that he had actually sent 2 of his sons. He felt we need to capture the areas around. We just right now have this little, they call Judea, this little piece of Israel. And it's not safe. It's just not safe now because any of the nations around us, any of the foreign elements that are living in Israel, they'll just attack us and destroy us. Okay, Assyria right now isn't bothering with us, but there's all the native populations that we have to deal with. And so he was very invested in fighting them. And he spent most of his reign fighting these foreign nations that were all in the surrounding areas. So it says when he was on Yom Kippur, though, he said he wasn't going to be fighting Yom Kippur. He's the high priest. He had to do the service. But he had sent his 2 sons to be leading the battle. It says that as he was in the Holy of Holies, he heard a heavenly voice coming out saying how his sons were going to have victory. So he was very holy. He was very righteous. He went, according to the sages, either 40 or 80 times he served as a high priest, went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, as we discussed perhaps when we mentioned the service of Yom Kippur, which we just discussed a few weeks ago, that the highlight of the service in the times of the temple was for the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies. It was the only day of year that the high priest went in. It was the only day of year anyone was allowed to go in. So one place, the Holy of Holies, where one person, the high priest, went in on one day of the year, Yom Kippur, 111. The high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And it says if the high priest wasn't worthy, he would die in the Holy of Holies. So they had him attached to like a rope because nobody else could walk in there. And if he wasn't coming out, they would pull him out. It was a red string. And if God forgave the Jews their sins, the string turned white. And if he didn't, it stayed red. And that would mean, of course, the high priest was dying, and they would have to pull him out because he'd be dead. And Yochanan Horkonos went in 80 or 40 times. There's 2 different versions in the Talmud. Remember, he was very holy because every year he went in, every year he walked out alive. He was worthy. He was worthy. He was worthy. But there was still this underlying conflict between him and the sages. Again, the primary reason for the conflict was that he didn't turn over the throne to the descendant of David. Now, obviously, he had the, if you want to call it popular support. I mean, obviously, from the people's perspective, the Chashmonaim were the saviors, which they were. So nobody was overtly pushing him. The sages didn't overtly push him to give up the throne, but he understood enough to know he was supposed to. He understood enough to know the sages disapproved of what he did. So his whole life, even though he was very righteous, very holy, very good, very committed to help the Jewish people, very committed to the sages, but he still felt this tension. He still felt this like, you don't really like me situation. Something else he was doing that the sages didn't really like was he put a lot of energy into fighting these wars, which the sages didn't feel was where he should go. And we're going to see this again in the future. This sense of the sages is like, don't expend all your energy and all the money and all the blood of the Jewish people on just fighting wars. Whatever God gave us, we have. Let's protect what we have, protect our borders, stay within our borders. We're okay within our borders, and just be strong within. Well, you know, these kings have this like lust for power, control, which means more land, more territory. So, of course, we see this in all of its modern day implications. And the perspective of the sages is that's not the way to go. It's not the safe road. That's a road that's wasting Jewish life and wasting Jewish money. So there was that tension between him and the sages. And then he did something that the sages really, really disapproved of. As we said, he had conquered this area. As I said, his fights were all within what we would view as Israel, but where all these other nations had taken control as the Jewish people went into exile and they came back, only a few of them, and everything that we went through. So these were the Edomim in the south. Edom is a descendant of Esav, Yitzchak, Isaac's brother Esav. So his descendants, Edom. So Yochanan Horkonos conquered them. And then, again, I don't think he had any bad intention. He was just completely wrong and completely against Jewish law, which is hard to understand because he was a righteous person. But sometimes things cloud your vision, which again is a really good lesson for us to understand that here, this very, very great person, far greater than us, but he still made very tragic mistakes. And that's why it's always important not to trust yourself and to consult with other people, consult with other Torah authorities before you do something very critical. In our world, is consult with a rabbi or consult with we have the concept called a mashpia, a spiritual mentor, a spiritual guide, because we can't always trust ourselves that we're seeing things properly. We're all very biased. And since we're biased, we both don't see the solutions to our own problems, and we don't always see the truth and what we're supposed to do in life because of our own biases. So Yochanan Horkonos was very, very great. As I'm saying, far greater than us. No question. We're talking about someone far greater than us. But he was human and he had a bias, and his bias was to have this power. And he, of course, convinced himself that the more land expansion and power they had, the better it would be for the Jewish people. Because what you want, your brain then supports. As Chassidus says, the ultimate power in us is our will. Nothing withstands willpower, which means if you want something, your brain is going to rationalize what you want, right? We like to think that we want what our brain says is correct, but Chassidus says it's not how we work. We want what we want, and then our brain rationalizes what we want, which is a good thing to also remember in life sometimes. Once we want what we want, then we just create excuses. So he wanted what he wanted, more land, more power. He's rationalizing, of course, that this is for the benefit of the Jewish people, because the sages, of course, thought it wasn't good. And then he said, well, look, I conquered this whole Edom area. I understand these people are very likely to rebel against me. So the only way I think I can really keep them in line is if I make them Jews, because then they'll be our people. We'll be one nation. So then we'll hey, no rebellion. You can't rebel against yourself. So he forcibly converted all of the Edomim, completely against what Torah says. Because as I'm sure we're all aware of, Torah actually discourages converts. We do not encourage converts. We do not forcibly convert. We discourage converts. And this is what he did. Again, I'm sure his intentions were good. I'm sure his intentions, he convinced himself, were only for the sake of the Jewish people. But this was a complete rift with Jewish law, which made the sages very upset with him. And as we will see, again, going back to what I was saying before, we see this so clearly in the history of the Chashmonaim. It's in your face. Again, the same theme that when you think when you're serving God, like I could think, oh, I'm such a good person. I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this for God. I'm doing this for God. I'm such a good person. And I don't realize that when I'm doing what God wants, that's good for me. And if I don't do what God wants, that's bad for me. So Yochanan Horkonos, okay, God doesn't want us to forcibly convert. Whatever. I don't know if that's what happened. It wasn't just that the sages were upset with him and everything that led from that. From these quasi-Jewish, not really Jewish, forcible converts came the destruction of the entire line of the Chashmonaim. All of them got wiped out, and came the destruction of the Jewish people, and came ultimately the Roman conquest of Israel. It all came from his forcible conversion of these Edomim. So when we're thinking, oh, this is what God wants, and sometimes it's hard to follow his rules, and life would be easier or better, or I'm smart if I just do it my own way. Maybe in this specific situation, God doesn't mind. Like, it generally doesn't want us to forcibly convert, but probably here it's okay because I think it's a good idea. When you're listening to what God says, it's not just good for you spiritually, it's good for you physically. Literally, his entire line got wiped out because of this, because of descendants of these forcible converts. And the whole land of Israel got given over to the Romans because of these forcibly converted people. So when you're doing what God wants, it works. It doesn't just work spiritually, which is very important. It works on every plane. And the most simple physical plane that we see, it works. And we see this so clearly, unfortunately, with what happened here. So at this point, Yochanan Horkonos now, he's at the end of his life. He's been the ruler, the king ruler. Of course, he didn't officially take the word king because he was a religious person. He knew he couldn't be the king for 31 years. And he turned completely against the sages and the entire tradition of Judaism in this final year of his life. Imagine going into the Holy of Holies 40 or 80 times, being a righteous ruler for 31 years, and in the last year of his life, completely flipping. But again, as we see, this came from years and years and years of this build up of like, they don't really like me, the sages don't really like me, they don't think I should be the ruler, they don't like that I'm fighting these wars, they got really mad at me when I was just doing something very good for the Jewish people, forcibly converting these Edomim, until finally, he kept hearing all these people in his court, because of course the court was full of the rich, more and more Hellenist leaning people, which means less and less authentic to the sages people. And they kept like whispering in his ears all of these bad things, and you first hear the whispers and you ignore them because they're stupid, and you hear them a second time, you ignore them, they're stupid. And by the time you hear them long enough, you start believing them, which is another very important point that we can all learn from this, that if someone's saying something to us and we know it's not true, but if we keep listening to it, eventually we start believing it, even though we know it's not true, but it sort of sinks in. So he kept hearing and hearing and hearing all the rich people in the court that were very anti the sages, anti the authentic Jewish tradition, because they didn't want them to have the power. They wanted to have the power. They wanted the power to be in the hands of the few people with money and not the average people that were loyal to the sages. They wanted the money, they wanted the power, and therefore they wanted the sages out. And of course, Yochanan Horkonos knew they were wrong and doing it for their own reasons. But year after year after year after year after year after year, hearing it again and again and again, at the end of his life, he bought it. And he became a complete, as we used the term before, and I explained the term in previous classes, Tzeduki. Tzeduki meaning someone who is, again, the term irreligious wasn't existent in those days, so that wasn't it. But it was a completely not following the oral tradition, not following the tradition as the sages have taught it over at this point for centuries, and saying, no, I could read the scriptures and decide how I'm supposed to serve God. You can read the scriptures and decide how you have to serve God. What do we need sages for? Why should we give them power? Why should we listen to them? I'm a Jew, you're a Jew, they're a Jew. They're looking at the words and saying it this way, I'm looking at the words and saying it this way. Again, this is obviously very big forerunners of what we know in our days as reform and conservative and such movements, but this was in essence this denial of the oral law. Same denial that we see in modern times. This is what they were contending with then. So here we had a lifetime of righteousness destroyed at the end of his life by his enormous suspicions against the sages, turning him into this full-blown Tzeduki that was rabidly persecuting the sages, and the sages had to literally flee because it was too dangerous. Because he was too paranoid. He had tremendous paranoia, which was his tremendous downfall. And again, it's very tragic because this is after an entire lifetime of real righteousness. So he made mistakes, but real righteousness, far greater than us, and yet he could still and did make mistakes. Now, when he died, and we're about 104 BCE, just to put this in a clock for us, he left instructions that his widow take over after him. It's very interesting that we see here, even though he turned at the end of his life, but he still knew what was what. He still trusted his wife. That was a wise move. But unfortunately, his oldest son did not follow this, did not follow his will, and he did not follow the thing, and he did not let the widow, meaning his mother, be the queen. And he imprisoned his brothers, and he said he's the ruler. So this is Yehuda Aristoblos, who was the oldest son of Yochanan Horkonos. So now we see this further degeneration in the Chashmonai line. Because here, first of all, we see a great degeneration because he actually proclaimed himself king. Until this time, meaning Shimon, Simon, the first ruler, didn't use the title king. He didn't last long because, as we said, he was murdered by his son-in-law, having made these fatal errors in not giving over the throne to the kings of David. His son, Yochanan Horkonos, who ruled after him for 31 years, at the end of his life, he turned, but he never called himself king. He knew he wasn't the king. His son, Yehuda Aristoblos, a mere grandson from the Chashmonai 5 brothers, he's already so far gone, he doesn't have any qualms. He calls himself king. And again, we think of the brothers, the 5 sons of Matisyahu, how they were so united, and they were the warriors that were fighting together and giving up their lives to save the Jews. And here, the grandson of Shimon, imprisons his brothers, not listening to his father's will, so he should become the king. This lust for power was so strong. As our sages say, power is a very dangerous thing. You have a little power, you just want it more and more and more. He wanted to be the king to the degree that he ignored his father's will and literally imprisoned his brothers. Now again, the first of the Chashmonai brothers that ruled, Shimon, Simon, he also suffered. He was murdered, but it was by his son-in-law. It's pretty bad. At least it wasn't direct Chashmonai that murdered him. But here, Yehuda Aristoblos, he's a Chashmonai. He's a grandson of Shimon. He's a great nephew of Yehuda Maccabee. And here he's imprisoning his brothers because he needs to be king. I think that's another very strong lesson, moral of the story we see very strongly here, which is this quest for power and how absolutely corruptive power is, as I'm sure we all know. But unfortunately, you see it here very, very tragically. But Yehuda Aristoblos did not last long because he was quite sick and he died without children. And when he died, his widow, Shlomis Alexandra, the first thing she did was release from prison her husband's brothers that he had put in prison. So at this point, now again, to understand what happened here, so Yehuda Aristoblos, he sees the power. He was the oldest son. He sees the power. Personally, he was very sickly, weak, and was never even able to have any children. So when he died and Shlomis Alexandra released the brothers, one of the brothers said, okay, now he should do what was the Jewish law at this time, which is called Yibum. Yibum, the concept of Yibum is that if a man passes away, never having had a child, then his wife should ideally marry one of his brothers, that they should have a child, and that child should continue the legacy of the dead man who never had children. They don't have to do this. It's an option. It's called Yibum. In Torah, if you look at it biblically, it writes Yibum and it writes an option called chalitza. Chalitza means if either the woman or the man does not want to do this, then there's a certain ceremony they perform which removes this obligation on them. So at this point, of course, now here, obviously Shlomo of Alexandria was the, so to speak, queen, the wife of the dead king, but everything was very shaky here. So when this brother was said, oh, he's going to do this yibum, obviously he was solidifying himself as the next king, which is, of course, what happened. And this was, you know, in a sense, again, it wasn't the wrong thing to do. This was the eldest of the brothers. So he was definitely the one who first should have been turned to for yibum. And he was, of course, happy to do yibum in this situation because this made him, he became the king. His name was Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai, unfortunately, now again, just to understand this, this is still the grandson of Shimon. Okay, we have the era of the Maccabees, Shimon, Yehuda, Elazar, the era of the Maccabees, and then we have, and then we have Yochanan Horkonos. We're dealing here with the sons of Yochanan Horkonos, so we're not that far from the Maccabees. Literally. Alexander Yanai, Shimon the Maccabee, was his grandfather. Yehuda the Maccabee was his great uncle. But we're light years away from the moral caliber, from the self-sacrifice for the Jewish people and the land of Israel of the Maccabees. We're with people that have fallen so fast. Again, probably because of this fatal mistake, this fatal not listening to God, which then led to this quick demise. So Alexander Yanai was very committed to trying to, as his father Yochanan Horkonos was trying, to conquer all of the lands. We said Yochanan Horkonos was very busy conquering lands, and we said the sages were not happy with it. But he was still, until the end of his life, nullified to the sages. At the very end of his life, he turned Sadduki. But until then, he was loyal to the sages. As versus Alexander Yanai. Alexander Yanai, all he cared about was another military victory and another military victory. He took the money of the Jews and he hired an army. This is a mercenary army, which means it wasn't an army of Jews. It's just, you know, people that were fighting for hire. And he hired this army to conquer more and more areas for the Jewish people. So the sages were very upset with what he was doing because they felt he was wasting the Jewish money on this. He was taking the treasuries and instead of using them to help the Jews, he was using them for this very expensive army. And just fighting to conquer more because again, more land, more people, more power. That was a formula. And the sages were like, well, what are we going in this direction for? That's not a Jewish direction. That's not what we need to do. We need to be safe. We need to be protected. We don't need to be conquering more and 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 more. There's no end. Because there was no end. Because if you want power, again, you're going to want more power, you're going to want more power, you're going to want more power. So now, so we have already from the beginning a tremendous tension between the king, Alexander Yanai, and the sages. First of all, he inherited all of his father's tensions, you know, that the Chashmonai are not supposed to be the kings, the descendants of David are, which is true. That the Chashmonai shouldn't be the high priests if they're the warriors, which is true. That the Chashmonai shouldn't be putting all this energy into fighting and trying to conquer more land. Instead, they should just try to stabilize the country, which is true. And it was just deteriorating more and more because his father, Yochanan Horkonos, was a very righteous person. Alexander Yanai was not. And his father at the end of his life turned. So his father had become Tzadduki. So he wasn't officially a Tzadduki, but he was, had a lot of tensions with the sages. Now his wife, remember, his wife is his older brother. He's the second brother. Yehuda Aristoblos was the oldest brother who had seized the throne and then died a year later. And then Alexander Yanai, the second brother, became king when he married his older brother's widow, Shlomo Alexandra. Now, Shlomo Alexander, now again, remember, their father was a very righteous person, Yochanan Horkonos. So he had gotten, for his oldest son, Yehuda Aristoblos, a very righteous woman. So Shlomo Alexandra was a very, very righteous woman. And even though she's in the court and she's surrounded by all these intrigues, and she's part of it, you know, her husband's the one that imprisons his brothers and doesn't give his mother the throne. And then when her husband dies, her brother-in-law marries her. I mean, obviously she agrees, but, you know, to continue this, she herself was completely righteous, and we'll see, but probably not today, maybe today, how righteous she truly was. So she stayed righteous, even though she's in the court for all these years. And in the court, again, the whispers in your ear are the whispers of these rich people that are very anti the sages, anti-following God's traditional laws. We don't need any interpretation. We can read the books the same way they do. What were the books? The books were the scriptures. We can read the scriptures. We can know how to serve God. Why do we have to listen how they say? We can do it ourselves. So the same way Yochanan Horkonos was hearing this in his ears for 30-some years and in the end succumbed, she was hearing it in her ears all these years, but she did not succumb. She stayed righteous. And one of the reasons why she did not succumb was she was very close to her brother. And her brother was a very, very great sage. He was actually the leader of the sages. His name was Shimon ben Shattach. A great, great, great leader, a great sage. His name is all over the place in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. So Shimon ben Shattach was the brother of Shlomo Alexandra. She was very close to her brother. So her brother obviously gave her a lot of moral backbone here, a lot of strength. So she did not succumb to all the whispers in her ears for all those years of, you know, power and wealth and conquest, and that's what's important, and the sages, tradition, that's for the common people. She did not succumb. So in the beginning, when her husband, Alexander Yanai, her new husband, after her previous husband, Yehuda Aristoblos, died, when her husband, Alexander Yanai, was feeling all this tension with the sages, both inherited from his father tensions, plus him continuing his father's path, some more tensions, she kept trying to like smooth things over, you know, like the good wife, she's trying to smooth things over. Here she's got her husband, here she's got her brother, she's trying to make sure it's all peace in the family. She's trying to keep everyone like, okay. But in the end, she couldn't hold her husband back because, again, both he knows the sages don't approve of him because the king should be descendant of David, and the sages don't approve of his fighting all these bloody wars and of his wasting all the Jews' money to hire this mercenary army to fight the wars. So he knows in the back of his head, the sages don't like me, the sages disapprove of me. So he had this sneaky suspicion the sages are going to try to push me out. Now, the sages didn't try to push him out. And we don't see this throughout the whole Chashmonai dynasty. It's sort of even a question we have. Why didn't the sages do that? Why didn't the sages at any point try to put a king from the line of David on the throne? We don't know. Maybe there was no worthy person that they felt was strong enough that could do the job. Maybe they felt they wouldn't have the support of the people. We don't know why they never tried. But the sages never tried at any point to literally depose the Chashmonai ruler. But the Chashmonai ruler felt that's what the sages were going to do because they don't like me and they know I'm not legit, and they don't like they don't like me historically, they don't like me for my ancestry, and they don't like me for what I'm doing. And then one of the people in his court, a Tzeduki, told him this false rumor. Now, this was not true. There was a false rumor that Yanai's mother had been violated by the Assyrian soldiers, which would therefore mean her son would not, of course he's still Jewish, it's not a question on his Judaism, but he would not be a priest, so he cannot serve as a priest. So this Tzeduki, now this is a false rumor, this actually wasn't true, but this was rumor, and there's lots of rumors that fly around about people, and the bigger the people, the more the rumors, obviously. But there was this false rumor flying around about Alexander Yanai, that, you know, his mother had been taken by the Syrian soldiers, and therefore he wasn't really a legitimate priest. This Tzeduki told Alexander Yanai that the sages started this rumor as a means of deposing him, as a means of getting rid of him. Again, not true. The sages had nothing to do with this rumor, and it wasn't. And it was not true either. I mean, it was false gossip. It wasn't even true gossip. It was false gossip. But when Alexander Yanai heard that, he believed it, as of course we have a tendency to believe these types of things. And he said, that's it, I'm a Tzeduki. Meaning his father, Yochanan Horkonos, at the end of his life, like, flipped and became a Tzeduki the last months of his life and destroyed a lifetime of goodness with these horrific acts he did at the end. Yehuda Aristoblos and Alexander Yanai didn't proclaim themselves Tzedukim. They were Tzeduki leaning. They weren't doing exactly what the sages wanted, but they didn't say, we are Tzedukim. Because again, we are Tzedukim means we are in battle against the sages. And they didn't do that. Again, Yehuda Aristoblos, he seized the throne, but he didn't fight the sages at all. He fought his brothers, he imprisoned them, he didn't fight the sages. Alexander Yanai, in the beginning, there was all these tensions, but he didn't openly fight the sages. I mean, meaning he wasn't the most righteous person, he wasn't the most virtuous person, but he wasn't fighting the sages. But when he heard, but there was a lot of undercurrents of anger and suspicion and fear. You know, a lot of kings lose their throne really fast in those days, as we've seen historically through, you know, all the non-Jewish kings and what happens in their rule. And obviously this was being mirrored by the Chashmonai here. So there's a lot of fear of losing the throne, fear of losing power, fear of the sages turning the people against him. And when he hears this rumor, he believed it completely. And he's like, whoa, this is what the sages are doing? They're spreading this false garbage about me. They're discrediting my lineage, which obviously is just a ploy to get me off the throne. So he said, that's it. I'm done with them. I'm a Tzeduki. Which means, in essence, at this point, he's going to war against the sages. And unfortunately, he continued ruling for many years. And he was, for many years, fighting this war against the sages. He said, any sage has to be arrested. And any sage he could arrest was tortured and was executed. And any sage who survived ran away. That was the only way he could survive at that point. Because he's the king, and he's saying, if you're a sage, you're a rebel. I'm the king. I'm saying that. Any sage is a rebel. Any sage has to be arrested. And arrested meant death. Torture and death, or just death. But that's what happened to all the sages he arrested. So to survive, he ran away, which is why many of the sages left Israel at this point, and they would run, let's say, to Egypt or to another neighboring area where there were Jews, because if they were under Alexander Yanai, they would be tortured and executed. So what happened now? So what happens now is you have an Israel without sages. Again, understand the what's going on in the land. He's the king. He's quasi knows the sages don't like him so much. But then he flips and becomes a warrior against the sages. He said, that's it, I'm a Tzeduki. I'm done with you guys. I'm going to kill every one of you. So to survive, they had to leave, or they had to be in hiding. So what's happening now to the Jewish people? So now you have a Jewish people without any sages to guide them. Because to survive, the sage had to be either in deep hiding or out of Israel. So what happened to the Jewish people? Suddenly the Jewish people are without teachers, without leaders, without guides. And therefore they fell very, very, very fast. So this was a tremendous tragedy. It wasn't just who's the king. It affected the entire Jewish people, because there's no more teachers of Torah for the Jews. And this became so crazy that even Alexander Yanai realized this is not working, because so fast, all the Jewish people just lost it, which shows us, again, there's so many lessons we see that they're so relevant to our times, which shows us how critical is the role of the teachers of Torah. the sages, the great rabbis, the great teachers of Torah, that if they're gone, the Jews are going to lose it. They need them to guide them. They need them for their own spiritual guidance and spiritual commitment. So the sages are gone. And all the Jewish people, every single one of them, falls. There's no teachers. There's no guides. There's no mentors. There's nobody telling you what's right. So you sort of from memory do what you can do, but you're going to do it. You're not going to do it. So very fast, the Jewish people fell to the degree this got so bad. Now, Alexander Yanai himself realized how crazy it was because he had this big banquet, this big official banquet. Of course, now again, he wanted, he's a Jewish king. So at the end of the banquet, he wanted someone to lead the grace. After a meal, you have the grace after the meal. So maybe he wasn't always so careful. He wasn't so religious, but he knows this is what you do. So here it's the end of this big official banquet, so he wants somebody to lead the grace. And nobody in the entire banquet knew how to say the grace. Imagine. Nobody in the whole banquet knew how to say the blessing after a meal. Many people, I'm sure, on this class know how to say the blessing when one finishes a meal. Not one person at the banquet could do it. They'd all forgotten. No sages to guide them, no one to mentor them, no one to inspire them to stay connected to God. It was another detail of Judaism that they just dropped. Look how fast the Jewish people fell. Alexander Yanai felt horrible. He's like, there's not one person here that can lead the grace after the meal? And his wife, remember, his wife was righteous the whole time. His wife said to him, she said, I can bring you someone who can say the grace, but only if you promise that you won't harm him. And he said, I promise. And she brought her brother, because she had been hiding her brother, Shimon ben Shattach. So she brought her brother out of hiding, and he led the grace. So when that happened, that was a very dramatic scene, if you can envision it. When that happened, Alexander Yanai sort of realized he can't do this. He can't destroy the sages. He didn't become righteous at that point. But he realized, like they say, you're cutting off your own hands. Like he was, Jews couldn't survive without the sages. A Jew can't even say the grace after the meal. The Jews can't survive without the sages. So he said, okay. He's not becoming so, as we call it, religious. He's not becoming so godly. He's still staying at Saduki, but he's not going to outright fight the sages. So because of this, the sages were able to come out of their hiding. Those sages that survived, unfortunately, many died. But the sages that survived came out of their hiding, and they were once again able to mentor the Jewish people. That didn't mean that Alexander Yanai was taking mentorship from them. He was still a self-proclaimed Saduki, but it meant that the Jewish people, as a people, were able to once again have the guidance and direction of the sages, and they would once again be able to come close to God. Well, I thought I would finish this today, but I don't think I will because I see it's late already. So we're going to stop here. We're toward the end, well, not really, of what happened with Alexander Yanai. Unfortunately, it just gets worse. It doesn't get better, it gets worse. Here we had like a little respite, like a little reprieve. He's letting the sages back. He realizes like he was conflicted. He was a Saduki, but he realizes without the sages, there's no Jews, which again, I think also has a lot of modern relevance because I think there are enough Jews today that understand that if we take away Judaism, the Jewish people aren't going to survive. They started, if you go back to Moses Mendelssohn and the Reform movement, with this vision that you could take away Judaism and still have the Jew without Judaism, the Jew who perfectly blends with the world because he doesn't have the archaic separating Judaism. He's just a Jew. And then over time we see it doesn't work, and many various proofs it didn't work. Obviously, the Holocaust was a massive proof since it started in Germany, in Berlin, where the heart of the Reform movement. down to today, where, you know, Jews see that when you have Jews without Judaism, in the end, you don't have Jews. And you really need the Judaism to keep the Jews. And just as we see this today, Alexander Yanai realized this then. So he didn't befriend the sages. He didn't become righteous. If you want to use the word religious, it wasn't really the term used in those days. He didn't become righteous. He wasn't following the sages. But he realized you can't take Judaism away from the Jews. If you do, there's no Jews left. You know, as he realized that there's a Jewish feast and we can't even make the blessing to God after the meal, we need the sages. So at this point, the sages were allowed to re-enter the society, and they continued to guide the Jewish people, but very cautiously. And as we're going to see, Alexander Yanai, unfortunately, was continued in ways that really upset the Jewish people and caused tremendous destruction of Jewish life. But sages just sort of waited it out. And we'll see the little ray of sunshine that happened after Alexander Yanai's rule, when his righteous wife, Shlomas Alexandra, Shloma, she has many different names in our history, but when she actually ruled and was the best ruler in the entire Chashmonai Dynasty. But we'll leave that for next week. Thank you for joining. I'm so sorry there was problems in the beginning, technical problems. Now we know the new password. And I hope I'll try it. Well, I guess to try, I'll need someone else to try it with me next week before to make sure we're still good. And thank you so much for joining. We should have a wonderful week. And again, keep in mind, this is supposed to be a great year. It's been a hard year. We've gone through a lot of hard stuff. Personally, America as a nation has, the world has, but we really started a new year that's really said by the Lubavitch Rebbe 30 years ago, it's supposed to be a really good year. So we should all see, hopefully we should see as this new year unfolds, that it is a really, really good year. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And mazel tov on your new granddaughter.
Thank you. Thank you. I know Mandy's been busy, so I haven't gotten any pictures yet either, but he'll probably, I imagine, start posting, hopefully. But thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Mazel
Thank
tov.
you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Bella. I really appreciate it. You know, you really feel the gift. You know, a new life is a gift.
It's
A
true.
gift. It's a gift.
True.
It's a gift. I'm grateful to God. I definitely am. Definitely am grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.